Welcome to chapter 8 of your history book, a chapter which talks about Ashoka, the emperor who gave up war. According to the timeline, we are going to talk about the period ranging from 321 BC to around 185 BC. The main points that will be discussed in this chapter are: what is the difference between empire and dynasty? The rise of the Mauryan Empire. We'll talk about Ashoka the Great. We'll talk about War of Kaling and how it affected King Ashok. We'll talk about Ashoka's Dhamma and his message for the future generation. At the end of the chapter, we'll be talking about Great Wall of China. Firstly, let's define dynasty. When the members of the same family become rulers one after the other, that family is called a dynasty. The Mauryans were a dynasty with three important rulers. First, Chandragupta Maurya, his son Bindusara, and Bindusara's son Ashoka. How were kingdoms different from empires? Empires were larger than kingdoms and they needed big armies. They also needed large number of officials who collected taxes. Now we'll talk about the Mauryan Empire. The empire where Ashoka ruled, it was founded by his grandfather Chandragupta Maurya more than 2300 years ago. Chandragupta was supported by a wise man named Chanakya, or commonly called Kautilya. Many of Chanakya's ideas were written down in a book called Arthashastra. If we look on the map, picture number 1 shows the state of Magadh. Picture number 2 and 3 was the extent of Chandragupta Maurya's empire. Picture 4 and 5 shows the expansion of empire during the reign of King Ashok. Ashoka was one of the greatest rulers known to history. And in what ways he was different? He was the first ruler who carried the messages to people by inscribing them on the rock pillars. His inscriptions were in Prakrit, written in Brahmi script. He fought the war of Kaling, and after this war, his life completely changed. He was the first king who gave up conquest after winning a war. His very famous Mauryan pillar found in Rampurva, Bihar, is now at Rashtrapati Bhavan. Ashoka's Dhamma, or in Sanskrit called Dharma, did not involve worship of God or performance of a sacrifice. He was also inspired by the teachings of Buddha. There were a number of problems that troubled him. People in the empire followed different religions, and this sometimes led to conflict. Slaves and servants were ill-treated. There were quarrels in the families and neighbors. Ashoka felt that it was his duty to solve these problems. So he appointed officials known as Dhamma Mahamata, who went from place to place teaching people about his Dhamma. Ashoka got his messages inscribed on rocks and pillars, instructing his officials to read his message to those who could not read it themselves. Ashoka's messages were inscribed: be gentle with slaves and servants, respect one's elders, treat all creatures with compassion, give gifts to Brahmins and monks. It is both wrong to praise one's own religion and criticize another's. Each one should respect the other religion. Taxes were levied on compulsion basis, whereas tribute meant that was the amount that was given by people on willingly basis. Whatever they had in abundance, they gave it to the heads. Now, descendant of Alexander, the Greek ruler of Western Asia named Seleucus Nicator, had sent Megasthenes to the court of Chandragupta Maurya. He, in his book, Megasthenes, in his book Indica, has given a brief description of the life during that time. He described Patliputra, which is now modern Patna. What all he has written is that Patna or Patliputra was a large and a beautiful city. It was surrounded by massive wall. It had 570 towers and 64 gates. The king's palace was also made up of wood and decorated with stone carvings. It had gardens and enclosure for keeping birds. The king had special servants who tasted the food first before the king eats. The king never slept in the same bedroom for 2 nights. In one of the inscriptions, King Ashoka has mentioned that 8 years after becoming king, he conquered Kalinga. And in that war, about 1.5 lakh people were captured and more than 1 lakh people were killed. He believed that winning people through Dharma was much better than conquering them through force. I am inscribing this message for the future so that my son and grandson after me should not think about war. Instead, they should think about spreading Dharma. These were the wordings on the pillars. At the end of the chapter, there is a mention of Great Wall of China. This is one structure that can be even seen from the space. This was built almost at the same time of the Mauryan Empire, and it took 2000 years. The construction of it continued for almost 2000 years, and it is around 6400 kilometers long. It is made up of stones and bricks with a road along the top. Several thousand people worked to build up the wall. With that, we come to the end of the chapter. Thank you.